Chapter 2. In spite of the rashly assumed Spencer, you would scarcely have thought, after a glance at the contours of the man's bony frame, that this was an artist. That conventional type which is privileged, in something of the same way as a Paris gamin, to represent riotous living to the bourgeois and Philistine mind. The most mirific joviality, in short, to use the old Rabelaisian word newly taken into use. Yet this elderly person had once taken the medal and the travelling scholarship. He had composed the first cantata crowned by the Institute at the time of the re-establishment of the Académie de Rome. He was Monsieur Sylvain Pons, in fact, Monsieur Sylvain Pons, whose name appears on the covers of well-known sentimental songs trilled by our mothers, to say nothing of a couple of operas, played in 1815 and 1816, and divers unpublished scores. The worthy soul was now ending his days as the conductor of an orchestra in a boulevard theatre, and a music master in several young ladies' boarding schools, a post for which his face particularly recommended him. He was entirely dependent upon his earnings, running about to give private lessons at his age. Think of it! How many a mystery lies in that unromantic situation! But the last man to wear the Spencer carried something about him besides his Empire associations. A warning and a lesson was written large over that triple waistcoat. Wherever he went, he exhibited, without fee or charge, one of the many victims of the fatal system of competition which still prevails in France, in spite of a century of trial without result. For Poisson de Marigny, brother of the Pompadour and director of fine arts, somewhere about 1746, invented this method of applying pressure to the brain. That was 100 years ago. Try if you can count upon your fingers the men of genius among the prize men of those 100 years. In the first place, no deliberate effort of schoolmaster or administrator can replace the miracles of chance which produce great men. Of all the mysteries of generation, this most defies the ambitious modern scientific investigator. In the second, the ancient Egyptians, we are told, invented incubator stoves for hatching eggs. What would be thought of Egyptians who should neglect to fill the beaks of the callow fledglings? Yet this is precisely what France is doing. She does her utmost to produce artists by the artificial heat of competitive examination. But the sculptor, painter, engraver, or musician once turned out by this mechanical process, she no more troubles herself about them and their fate than the dandy cares for yesterday's flower in his buttonhole. And so it happens that the really great man is a Greuze, a Watteau, a Félicien David, a Pagnesi, a Géricault, a Decamps, an Aubé, a David d'Angers, an Eugène Delacroix, or a Meissonier, artists who take but little heed of Grand Prix, and spring up in the open field under the rays of that invisible sun called vocation. To resume. The government sent Sylvain Pons to Rome to make a great musician of himself. And in Rome, Sylvain Pons acquired a taste for the antique and works of art. He became an admirable judge of those masterpieces of the brain and hand, which are summed up by the useful neologism bric-a-brac. And when the child of Euterpe returned to Paris somewhere about the year 1810, it was in the character of a rabid collector, loaded with pictures, statuettes, frames, wood-carving, ivories, enamels, porcelains, and the like. He had sunk the greater part of his patrimony, not so much in the purchases themselves, as on the expenses of transit, and every penny inherited from his mother had been spent in the course of a 3 years' travel in Italy after the residence in Rome came to an end. He had seen Venice, Milan, Florence, Bologna, and Naples leisurely, as he wished to see them, as a dreamer of dreams and a philosopher, careless of the future, for an artist looks to his talent for support, as the fille de joie counts upon her beauty. All through those splendid years of travel, Pons was as happy as was possible to a man with a great soul, a sensitive nature, and a face so ugly that any success with the fair, to use the stereotyped formula of 1809, was out of the question. The realities of life always fell short of the ideals which Pons created for himself. The world without was not in tune with the soul within, but Pons had made up his mind to the dissonance. Doubtless the sense of beauty that he had kept pure and living in his inmost soul was the spring from which the delicate, graceful, and ingenious music flowed and won him reputation between 1810 and 1814. Every reputation founded upon the fashion or the fancy of the hour, or upon the short-lived follies of Paris, produces its Pons. No place in the world is so inexorable in great things, no city of the globe so disdainfully indulgent in small. Pons's notes were drowned before long in floods of German harmony and the music of Rossini. And if in 1824 he was known as an agreeable musician, a composer of various drawing-room melodies, judge if he was likely to be famous in 1831. In 1844, the year in which the single drama of this obscure life began, Sylvain Pons was of no more value than an antediluvian semiquaver. Dealers in music had never heard of his name, though he was still composing, on scanty pay, for his own orchestra or for neighboring theatres. And yet the worthy man did justice to the great masters of our day. A masterpiece finely rendered brought tears to his eyes. But his religion never bordered on mania, as in the case of Hoffmann's Chryslers. He kept his enthusiasm to himself. His delight, like the paradise reached by opium or hashish, lay within his own soul. The gift of admiration, of comprehension, the single faculty by which the ordinary man becomes the brother of the poet, is rare in the city of Paris, that inn whither all ideas, like travellers, come to stay for a while. So rare is it that Pons surely deserves our respectful esteem. His personal failure may seem anomalous, but he frankly admitted that he was weak in harmony. He had neglected the study of counterpoint. There was a time when he might have begun his studies afresh and held his own among modern composers, when he might have been, not certainly a Rossini, but an Hérold, but he was alarmed by the intricacies of modern orchestration, and at length, in the pleasures of collecting, he found such ever-renewed compensation for his failure, that if he had been made to choose between his curiosities and the fame of Rossini, will it be believed, Pons would have pronounced for his beloved collection. Pons was of the opinion of Chenavard, the print collector, who laid it down as an axiom that you only fully enjoy the pleasure of looking at your Ruysdael, Hobbema, Holbein, Raphael, Murillo, Greuze, Sebastian del Piombo, Giorgione, Albrecht Dürer, or what not, when you have paid less than 60 francs for your picture. Pons never gave more than 100 francs for any purchase. If he laid out as much as 50 francs, he was careful to assure himself beforehand that the object was worth 3,000. The most beautiful thing in the world, if it cost 300 francs, did not exist for Pons. Rare had been his bargains, but he possessed the 3 qualifications for success: a stag's legs, an idler's disregard of time, and the patience of a Jew. This system, carried out for 40 years in Rome or Paris alike, had borne its fruits. Since Pons returned from Italy, he had regularly spent about 2,000 francs a year upon a collection of masterpieces of every sort and description, a collection hidden away from all eyes but his own. And now his catalogue had reached the incredible number of 1,907. Wandering about Paris between 1811 and 1816, he had picked up many a treasure for 10 francs, which would fetch 1,000 or 1,200 today. Some 45,000 canvases change hands annually in Paris picture sales, and these Pons had sifted through year by year. Pons had Sèvres porcelain, pâte tendre bought of Auvergnat, those satellites of the Black Band who sacked chateaux and carried off the marvels of Pompadour France in their tumbrel carts. He had, in fact, collected the drifted wreck of the 17th and 18th centuries. He recognized the genius of the French school, and discerned the merit of the Lepôtre and Lavallée Poussin and the rest of the great obscure creators of the genre Louis XV and the genre Louis XVI. Our modern craftsmen now draw, without acknowledgment, from them, pore incessantly over the treasures of the Cabinet des Estampes, borrow adroitly, and give out their pastiches for new inventions. Pons had obtained many a piece by exchange, and therein lies the ineffable joy of the collector. The joy of buying bric-a-brac is a secondary delight. In the give and take of barter lies the joy of joys. Pons had begun by collecting snuff-boxes and miniatures. His name was unknown in bric-a-bracology, for he seldom showed himself in sales-rooms or in the shops of well-known dealers. Pons was not aware that his treasures had any commercial value. The late lamented du Sommerard tried his best to gain Pons's confidence, but the prince of bric-a-brac died before he could gain an entrance to the Pons Museum, the one private collection which could compare with the famous Sauvageot Museum. Pons and Monsieur Sauvageot indeed resembled each other in more ways than one. Monsieur Sauvageot, like Pons, was a musician. He was likewise a comparatively poor man, and he had collected his bric-a-brac in much the same way, with the same love of art, the same hatred of rich capitalists with well-known names, who collect for the sake of running up prices as cleverly as possible. There was yet another point of resemblance between the pair. Pons, like his rival competitor and antagonist, felt in his heart an insatiable craving after specimens of the craftsman's skill and miracles of workmanship. He loved them as a man might love a fair mistress. An auction in the sale-rooms of the Rue des Jeuneurs, with its accompaniments of hammer-strokes and brokers' men, was a crime of lèse bric-a-brac in Pons's eyes. Pons's museum was for his own delight at every hour. For the soul created to know and feel all the beauty of a masterpiece has this in common with the lover: today's joy is as great as the joy of yesterday. Possession never palls, and a masterpiece happily never grows old. So the object that he held in his hand with such fatherly care could only be a find, carried off with what affection amateurs alone know. After the first outlines of this biographical sketch, everyone will cry at once, "Why, this is the happiest man on earth, in spite of his ugliness." And in truth, no spleen, no dullness can resist the counter-irritant supplied by a craze, the intellectual moxa of a hobby. You who can no longer drink of the cup of pleasure, as it has been called through all ages, try to collect something, no matter what. People have been known to collect placards. So shall you receive the small change for the gold ingot of happiness. Have you a hobby? You have transferred pleasure to the plane of ideas. And yet you need not envy the worthy Pons. Such envy, like all kindred sentiments, would be founded upon a misapprehension. With a nature so sensitive, with a soul that lived by tireless admiration of the magnificent achievements of art, of the high rivalry between human toil and the work of nature, Pons was a slave to that one of the 7 deadly sins with which God surely will deal least hardly. Pons was a glutton. A narrow income, combined with a passion for bric-a-brac, condemned him to a regimen so abhorrent to a discriminating palate that, bachelor as he was, he had cut the knot of the problem by dining out every day. Now, in the time of the Empire, celebrities were more sought after than at present, perhaps because there were so few of them, perhaps because they made little or no political pretension. In those days, besides, you could set up for a poet, a musician, or a painter with so little expense. Pons, being regarded as the probable rival of Niccolo, Paër, and Bertin, used to receive so many invitations that he was forced to keep a list of engagements, much as barristers note down the cases for which they are retained. And Pons behaved like an artist. He presented his amphitrions with copies of his songs. He obliged at the pianoforte. He brought them orders for boxes at the Feydeau, his own theatre. He organized concerts. He was not above taking the fiddle himself sometimes in a relation's house and getting up a little impromptu dance. In those days, all the handsome men in France were away at the wars, exchanging sabre cuts with the handsome men of the coalition. Pons was said to be not ugly, but peculiar-looking, after the grand rule laid down by Molière in Eliante's famous couplets. But if he sometimes heard himself described as a charming man, after he had done some fair lady a service, his good fortune went no further than words. It was between the years 1810 and 1816 that Pons contracted the unlucky habit of dining out. He grew accustomed to see his hosts taking pains over the dinner, procuring the first and best of everything, bringing out their choicest vintages, seeing carefully to the dessert, the coffee, the liqueurs, giving him of their best, in short. The best, moreover, of those times of the Empire when Paris was glutted with kings and queens and princes, and many a private house emulated royal splendors. People used to play at royalty then, as they play nowadays at Parliament, creating a whole host of societies, with presidents, vice-presidents, secretaries, and what-not. Agricultural societies, industrial societies, societies for the promotion of sericulture, viticulture, the growth of flax, and so forth. Some have even gone so far as to look about them for social evils in order to start a society to cure them. But to return to Pons. A stomach thus educated is sure to react upon the owner's moral fibre. The demoralization of the man varies directly with his progress in culinary sapience. Voluptuousness, lurking in every secret recess of the heart, lays down the law therein. Honor and resolution are battered in breach. The tyranny of the palate has never been described. As a necessity of life, it escapes the criticism of literature. Yet no one imagines how many have been ruined by the table. The luxury of the table is indeed in this sense the courtesan's one competitor in Paris, besides representing in a manner the credit side in another account, where she figures as the expenditure. With Pons's decline and fall as an artist came his simultaneous transformation from invited guest to parasite and hanger-on. He could not bring himself to quit dinners so excellently served for the Spartan broth of a 2-franc ordinary. Alas, alas, a shudder ran through him at the mere thought of the great sacrifices which independence required him to make. He felt that he was capable of sinking to even lower depths for the sake of good living, if there were no other way of enjoying the first and best of everything, of guzzling, vulgar but expressive word, nice little dishes carefully prepared. Pons lived like a bird, pilfering his meal, flying away when he had taken his fill, singing a few notes by way of return. He took a certain pleasure in the thought that he lived at the expense of society, which asked of him what but the trifling toll of grimaces. Like all confirmed bachelors who hold their lodgings in horror, and live as much as possible in other people's houses, Pons was accustomed to the formulas and facial contortions which do duty for feeling in the world. He used compliments as small change. and as far as others were concerned, he was satisfied with the labels they bore, and never plunged a too curious hand into the sack. This not intolerable phase lasted for another 10 years. Such years! Pons's life was closing with a rainy autumn. All through those years he contrived to dine, without expense, by making himself necessary in the houses which he frequented. He took the first step in the downward path by undertaking a host of small commissions. Many and many a time Pons ran on errands instead of the porter or the servant. Many a purchase he made for his entertainers. He became a kind of harmless, well-meaning spy sent by one family into another, but he gained no credit with those for whom he trudged about, and so often sacrificed self-respect. "Pons is a bachelor," said they. "He is at a loss to know what to do with his time. He is only too glad to trot about for us. What else would he do?" Very soon the cold which old age spreads about itself began to set in, the communicable cold which sensibly lowers the social temperature, especially if the old man is ugly and poor. Old and ugly and poor, is not this to be thrice old? Pons's winter had begun, the winter which brings the reddened nose and frost-nipped cheeks and the numbed fingers. Numb in how many ways? Invitations very seldom came for Pons now. So far from seeking the society of the parasite, every family accepted him, much as they accepted the taxes. They valued nothing that Pons could do for them. Real services from Pons counted for naught. The family circles in which the worthy artist revolved had no respect for art or letters. They went down on their knees to practical results. They valued nothing but the fortune or social position acquired since the year 1830. The bourgeoisie is afraid of intellect and genius, but Pons's spirit and manner were not haughty enough to overawe his relations, and naturally he had come at last to be accounted less than nothing with them, though he was not altogether despised. He had suffered acutely among them, but, like all timid creatures, he kept silence as to his pain, and so by degrees schooled himself to hide his feelings, and learned to take sanctuary in his inmost self. Many superficial persons interpret this conduct by the short word selfishness. And indeed, the resemblance between the egoist and the solitary human creature is strong enough to seem to justify the harsher verdict, and this is especially true in Paris, where nobody observes others closely, where all things pass swift as waves, and last as little as a ministry. So Cousin Pons was accused of selfishness behind his back, and if the world accuses anyone, it usually finds him guilty and condemns him into the bargain. Pons bowed to the decision. Do any of us know how such a timid creature is cast down by an unjust judgment? Who will ever paint all that the timid suffer? This state of things, now growing daily worse, explains the sad expression on the poor old musician's face. He lived by capitulations, of which he was ashamed. Every time we sin against self-respect at the bidding of the ruling passion, we rivet its hold upon us. The more that passion requires of us, the stronger it grows, every sacrifice increasing, as it were, the value of a satisfaction for which so much has been given up, till the negative sum total of renouncements looms very large in a man's imagination. Pons, for instance, after enduring the insolently patronizing looks of some bourgeois encased in buckram of stupidity, sipped his glass of port or finished his quail with breadcrumbs, and relished something of the savour of revenge besides. "It is not too dear at the price," he said to himself. After all, in the eyes of the moralist, there were extenuating circumstances in Pons's case. Man only lives, in fact, by some personal satisfaction. The passionless, perfectly righteous man is not human. He is a monster, an angel wanting wings. The angel of Christian mythology has nothing but a head. On earth, the righteous person is the sufficiently tiresome Grandison, for whom the very Venus of the crosswords is sexless. Setting aside one or two commonplace adventures in Italy, in which probably the climate accounted for his success, no woman had ever smiled upon Pons. Plenty of men are doomed to this fate. Pons was an abnormal birth. The child of parents well stricken in years, he bore the stigma of his untimely genesis. His cadaverous complexion might have been contracted in the flask of spirit of wine in which science preserves some extraordinary fetus. Artist though he was, with his tender, dreamy, sensitive soul, he was forced to accept the character which belonged to his face. It was hopeless to think of love, and he remained a bachelor, not so much of choice as of necessity. Then gluttony, the sin of the continent monk, beckoned to Pons. He rushed upon temptation as he had thrown his whole soul into the adoration of art and the cult of music. Good cheer and bric-a-brac gave him the small change for the love which could spend itself in no other way. As for music, it was his profession, and where will you find the man who is in love with his means of earning a livelihood? For it is with a profession as with marriage. In the long length you are sensible of nothing but the drawbacks. Brillat-Savarin has deliberately set himself to justify the gastronome, but perhaps even he has not dwelt sufficiently on the reality of the pleasures of the table. The demands of digestion upon the human economy produce an internal wrestling bout of human forces which rivals the highest degree of amorous pleasure. The gastronome is conscious of an expenditure of vital power, an expenditure so vast that the brain is atrophied, as it were, that a second brain located in the diaphragm may come into play, and the suspension of all the faculties is in itself a kind of intoxication. A boa constrictor gorged with an ox is so stupid with excess that the creature is easily killed. What man, on the wrong side of 40, is rash enough to work after dinner? And remark, in the same connection, that all great men have been moderate eaters. The exhilarating effect of the wing of a chicken upon invalids recovering from serious illness and long confined to a stinted and carefully chosen diet has been frequently remarked. The sober Pons, whose whole enjoyment was concentrated in the exercise of his digestive organs, was in the position of chronic convalescence. He looked to his dinner to give him the utmost degree of pleasurable sensation, and hitherto he had procured such sensations daily. Who dares to bid farewell to old habit? Many a man on the brink of suicide has been plucked back on the threshold of death by the thought of the café where he plays his nightly game of dominoes.